What am I saying? Welcome to the Real News Podcast?
Yeah, the first.
Well, I mean, we have a podcast. Just
It's a
not
Baltimore
this one.
podcast.
Yeah.
It's the first Real News podcast.
Welcome to the other Real News Podcast.
All right. Welcome to this Real News Podcast. I'm Marc Steiner. Good to have you with us today. And I'm here with the editor-in-chief here at the Real News, Paul Jay, and our chief climate correspondent, Dharna Noor. Folks, good to have you all in the studio at one time.
Thank
Hi,
you, Mark.
Thanks.
Let's start this way. The last time I talked to you, Paul, on the air, I got a response from a friend of mine who could not get it on the website. And this is what he wrote. Nick Sheridan, he wrote, "Hey, Mark, distressed to read," so he must have read the transcript, "your non-critical interview with Paul Jay, where he invents the term Russophobia to whitewash Putin for what he did to our democracy in 2016 and appears to be continuing. Apparently, even the corrupt Russian oligarchs are the fault of the United States, not Russia." So how do you respond to the viewer of Real News?
First of all, it's a great letter because it was something I was wanting to explain during our session or give my opinion about. And because of time, I didn't get a chance to expand on it. And first of all, I didn't invent the term Russophobia. We didn't know whether to call it Russophobia, Russophobia, or we didn't know what to call it. We looked at what other other people were calling it, and we found in The Nation and some other places this term,
right,
Russophobia. So, but the real point he raises is even the rise of the oligarchs, he says, I'm saying, is even the Americans' fault.
And you're not saying that.
I'm not saying that. And to use an old Marxist terminology, and I don't mind once in a while because I have a lot of respect for what Marx had to say, there's a thing in dialectical and historical materialism, and the framing goes like this. The basis of change is internal. The condition for change is external. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter what the Americans might have done if the socialist system in the Soviet Union hadn't degenerated, if it hadn't become such a bureaucracy. I mean, a lot of the oligarchs, most of the oligarchs were actually party functionaries who wanted to get rich. This was an internal development of the way socialism, whatever you want to call that system, right, what it became. So that's the basis of change, is the degeneration of socialism in the Soviet Union. And whether the Americans were involved or not, that process had its own legs. On the other hand, after 1990, shock therapy, the Americans were very involved in supporting Yeltsin, were very involved in creating this free-for-all to loot the publicly owned assets of the Soviet Union and turn them into private assets. Now, I think the Americans, in fact, were very disappointed that most of those assets went into the hands of what became the Russian oligarchy. And I think that's part of the contradiction that still exists, why there's antagonism for the current Russian government and Russian oligarchy, because the Americans said, geez, after all these years, we finally bring down the Soviet Union and we don't get our hands on the oil and all the riches. So I am not saying that this is primarily an American thing that gave rise to the oligarchy, but as an external condition, sure, it played a significant role in how it unfolded.
Well, Donna, are you going to say something before I?
No. I mean, go. I can hold my question.
You don't have to.
I guess I'm wondering if you think that any of those sort of like McCarthyist impulses and that like the history of, that whatever sort of manufactured backlash to socialism has anything to do with now the corporate media's focus on the apparent interference of Russia in the election in 2016. Or are they two completely separate issues?
Well, they're all interconnected.
How could they not be?
It's all interconnected,
Yeah,
but let me kind of split this up a bit. I do not know whether or not the Russians did something or another in the elections itself. I find it perfectly believable that they might have. I find it perfectly believable that they did next to nothing and it's being exaggerated.
Sure.
I think there's plenty of smoke and fire on the corruption side, links between Trump and money laundering. There's lots of looks like some real stuff there. And perhaps there was real stuff, certainly in terms of digging up dirt. Does Russian intelligence know some stuff that Trump could use against Clinton? Were there contacts at that level? It seems very possible. And we know there's certainly some meetings took place that looks like that's what they're for.
Sure.
That being said, this is normal stuff. This is minor stuff in the scheme of how competing mid and big capitalist countries relate to each other. It's being blown up to such a significance, not because the American media cares about American democracy, because if they cared about American democracy, clearly, as I've been saying all along, there's far, far greater threats to American democracy coming from the billionaires of America.
Right.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I think that, first of all, the issue about Russia is huge because, I mean, I'm one of those who does believe they interfered in this election. I think the evidence points directly in that to their interference in this election.
I mean, at some point, Oscar, what evidence? But anyway, go on.
Well, we can get into that. But the other part is, I don't think they were as I wrote back to my friend who wrote in, I don't think that their interference
was the deciding
factor in Hillary Clinton's losing this election. And so I think that's something I'm always saying. That's yes, but no, you can't, and we have to be clear about that. But the other thing is that the reason I think that sometimes the arguments like we're making here at this moment people don't pay attention to and don't care about is because people are more concerned with some people are more concerned with what the ascendancy of this right-wing, racist, nationalist group seizing a huge portion of political power in this country.
Sure.
That's what people are worried about. That's why people who were for Bernie ended up working, most of them anyway, either working for and or voting for Hillary because of that. And the reason people don't care about the oligarch question, I think, is because they're really concerned about what's happening to this country and where Trump is taking it.
And what kind of oligarchs we're getting.
And clearly Trump had dealings with Russia. Clearly his business dealings were involved there. All these folks around him are going to fall. And I think he may or may not fall in this. Who knows? We'll see how the political issue unravels in the Senate. I mean, the Congress will probably vote to impeach, is my guess, in the next session at some point. The question is whether the Senate will, I think, have to vote on it one way or the other once Congress impeaches, the House impeaches. So, I mean, I think there is a there. I just don't think that's what caused Trump to win.
Well, I don't think there's any question it isn't what caused Trump to win. But this is why you have to separate two issues. If they can, from the interest of real democracy, not the BS democracy they claim Russia interfered with, but in terms of the rights of people and the savage attack of the Trump administration on the people, the more the elites fight, the more they wound this far-right administration and the pools of capital behind him, the better. What I don't like, and why I think we need to say, don't use this to stoke the fires of the Cold War and American chauvinism, and don't create illusions about who Putin is either.
Yeah.
We can do all of the above. We do not have to prettify Putin, and let's stop saying
he's
just
some socialist hero or something.
Well, no, that as if he's the devil.
Oh, sure.
Or prettify him that he's not the devil.
Sure.
He's neither the devil or
the
is the
worst.
devil, and it's not just about Putin. I mean, Putin's going to leave the stage of history sooner or later. It's about a whole class of oligarchs, a state that came out into being to deal with the chaos of the 90s, but mostly to deal with it in the interest of the rising class of oligarchs. So we're dealing with a state, and that state has criminal elements to it. Certainly the oligarchs have all kinds of criminality. The state led by Putin, allied with this far-right Russian Orthodox Church. Putin's extremely clever in the way he plays with right-wing organizations and nurtures them in Europe, and then plays with lefties through RT in North America. But let's not forget, It's a mid-level, small, relatively small economy, small military force.
Yeah, I think, but
And let me finish the
yeah,
point.
But you're
So
you're
let's-
diminishing their power too much.
I'm not diminishing their power. Look at the actual numbers. I mean, the actual size of the economy. The problem is the American chauvinism runs deep in the American left. And they want to attack the Russians as if it's anything close to the criminality of the Americans.
Yeah, I think
you can't even compare the two.
Really, and I think especially like when I hear people my age who are sort of have broad Democratic Party allegiance, there's a lot of pearl clutching when it comes to potential Russian interference in the elections, when there's like no understanding of the amount of the history of American interference in so many elections, and like the U.S.'s complete disinterest in any like self-determination in Latin America or in the Middle East, arming of groups that are directly in opposition to those sort of democratic forces. And that I think is like a sort of forgotten history in the sort of coverage that you see on like a CNN or an MSNBC. But again, I don't think that's to say that it's not possible that there was interference, just like as though interference in a democratic process is weird or unheard of.
No, I mean, and I think, and there's a history of the Soviet Union before Russia, the Russian government now, and the U.S. being involved in elections in Europe, both trying to involve themselves in elections in Europe. And we talked about Italy before. Italy is one of the major examples where that happened.
Sure.
And I think that Russia's economy may be nowhere as near as powerful as the United States economy or China's economy. I don't think there's any question about that. But their political influence is huge around the globe.
Oh, God, not even close to the United States and China, like such a minor league way. Maybe along its borders, yeah.
But strategically, I mean,
it's a regional power.
Whether it's Russia's support of Assad and what's happening in Syria. I mean, the internal stuff, the repression against Muslims inside of Russia, like the repression against Muslims in China, all that's taking place as well. I mean,
wait a sec. No, but I'm not in any way suggesting this isn't a repressive, autocratic. It could very easily become a very nationalist, even fascist state. Those forces exist there. But let's not in any way diminish what the reality of the balance of this is. I mean, what the United States has done since World War II, its global footprint, from Vietnam to what they did in Africa to Iraq. I mean, go on and on about it. There's nothing that this current Russian state has done outside its own borders that compares with the scale of the crimes of the United States. And it's a very chauvinist position, not when you're an American, to not keep reminding people of that. Otherwise, you create this BS illusion that America's always fought. Like, here's the American logic, and a lot of the left falls for this crap. America does bad things, but for good reasons. American intent's always good. Yeah, we supported a bunch of dictators, but we really wanted democracy.
Yeah.
Of course, everyone else does bad things for bad reasons. And that's BS.
Well, okay. We're going to say, Dharna?
No, I mean, that's what I was saying as well. But I think that there are segments of like the American left that turn that into, and therefore there's nothing bad about Russia. And that's not what you're saying at all. Like you're still admitting like, yes, okay, it's a state where there's like, it's rife with authoritarianism. There is still an oligarchy. It's just not an oligarchy that has as much power as the U.S.
Like, how critical I am of Saudi Arabia. Yeah. I mean, there's not a thing about that Saudi state that shouldn't be savaged. The criminality they're responsible for, and on and on and on. It's still nothing compared to what the United States has done. And in fact, the Saudis couldn't even do what they want to do. In fact, when Trump said you wouldn't last 2 weeks without us, it's true. But just at the scale of the crimes, American foreign policy is just at a level that no one approaches.
Well, look, a couple of things. It's interesting, the reactions I'm having to the conversation here. Visceral, it was on one side.
Especially a guy who's been fighting against U.S. foreign policy his whole life.
Me.
Right? Yeah, yes, you. Right. I mean, I'm talking about you. I mean, for anyone listening to Marc Steiner, this guy's been an activist against the American oligarchs his whole life. So
I guess part of it is that the reason I guess that here's what my visceral reaction was. that you can't organize in the United States and organize an opposition in the United States to change the nature of this country, political nature of this country, and act as if we hate this country, which some people do sometimes, right? You can't do that because people aren't going to buy it. Because nationalist feelings are nationalist feelings no matter where you come from, and people have them. Most people have them. So I'm just saying that. And the other part is, of course, the United States. I mean, one of the things I will give the New York Times in this is they did a series of really good articles about the Russian intervention, focusing on what the Americans have done in elections for the last 60 years on this planet, and interrupting other people's elections, and overthrowing Arbenz, and overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran, and Arbenz in Guatemala, and the interference in the Italian election, and the Chilean election,
And the Canadian.
and that Diffenbacher. Nobody knows Diffenbacher unless you're Canadian, but they did in 1961.
They overthrew Diefenbaker.
They overthrew Diffenbacher
Because he wouldn't accept nuclear missiles on Canadian soil.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, that's all real, and I think but I think that there's got to be a bridge here between that understanding and the deep fear that a majority of Americans have about Trump and what he represents, which is why there's this broad coalition in this country that's happening, even though it's very divisive internally, broad coalition confronting this because the ugliest, meanest, most racist, vile elements in our country, this country, in the United States, are in ascendancy. That's a real danger. When people argue with me about, well, why did Valerie, my wife, who also works here, why did she go to Pennsylvania door to door for Hillary Clinton? And if you ask her, she'll say because you had to stop that racist bastard and the people around him from getting into the White House. That's the fear people have. So sometimes when we end up feeling like we're sounding as if we're defending Russia, which I know you're not saying, Paul. But the reality is people care less about that than they do about if Russia was involved and Trump was involved and his people were involved, maybe that's the way we can stop them and get rid of them.
Yeah, I get where you're heading here.
I mean, that's...
See, my response is we should not stoke the fires of chauvinism. We should not bring up the ghosts and demons of the Cold War, take advantage of this horrible mentality of demonizing others, especially Russia, but it's easily going to be China. Look at your watch tomorrow.
Yeah.
In order to make the point that this far-right administration needs to come down, that we cannot allow the far right of the United States to take over power. Because in the long run, it's going to come back and bite us in the ass because, I'll give you a concrete example, the demonization of Iran. Now, I don't defend the Iran administration, and I make a point at the Real News that we've done a lot of stories about worker strikes in Iran and the jailing of the head of the bus drivers union and the repression and the executions. I mean, the Iranian, if I were an Iranian, I would fight to overthrow this theocratic kind. It's not fair to call it fascist because next to the Saudis, it's bloody democratic. On the other hand, it's a very reactionary, repressive state.
Sure.
We always say that. On the other hand, the demonization of this state in order to prepare conditions to try to either overthrow it or bomb it or start a war with it, we never shut up about that. I mean, our point is, it's our job to tell the whole truth. And if the world's a little complicated, then we better say so and try to get people clear about it. We can do both. We can say, don't stoke the fires of hysterical chauvinism about Russia. Tell the truth about a repressive regime in Russia. Tell the truth about what's wrong with Trump. But let's fight Trump based on his horrible attacks on the American people, not some minor stuff about Russia that someday could help start a war with Russia. I mean, I did these interviews with Ellsberg. Don't take unseriously the possibilities of nuclear war with Russia, even if it starts accidentally, but it could be accidentally within a time of extreme tension.
Well, I mean, what's happened is we've forgotten completely in this country how dangerous and how real the possibility is of nuclear war. I mean, it used to be on everybody's mind. You know, if you grew up in a certain era, as I did in this country, you know, you remember hiding under the desk. You know, that was going to happen to you at a moment. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was in high school, and we all thought we were going to die that day, that the war was going to start, and we were all going to be dead.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, that so
We used to do the going under the desk
desks,
thing.
right? Yeah, right.
So now we do that about
See your
school
ass out of the
shootings.
desk, and that was going to help you with your ass sticking out of the desk and your head down the floor.
I
but yeah, Dharna.
Well, I guess
please.
maybe the sort of obvious viewer question in response to what you said, though, then, Paul, is like, where are the real news stories about workers going on strike in Russia, or where's the like stories about opposition in Russia to Putin?
Oh, we've
Where's
done
the-
them. In fact,
Right,
one of the
but-
earliest stories we did was about the killing of journalists in Russia.
Agreed. And I think the answer is like, yeah, we want to do more of everything, and there's only so many of us, and we only have so many hours to do.
But we just
every
did
story,
a
but-
multi-part series with Alexander Buzgalin.
Yeah, sure.
And a lot of that was about the rise of this autocratic state.
Sure.
About, you know, and it's an objective process. You had this chaos, and in order to have some normalization of capitalism in the chaos of the 90s, they needed a very strong state that could start normalizing laws. Why? So the oligarchs could make even more money. You know, they didn't do it because they wanted to have anything else. It's driven by the interests of the oligarchs. But it's an objective process. It's not about evil Putin, the richest man in the world who's trying to take over. I mean, this is chauvinism when you talk like
Putin
that.
is not trying to take over the United States.
No. Not even trying to take over the world because he can't.
But-
Listen, Trudeau in Canada, if he could be the world hegemon, he'd be there tomorrow. Sweden. There's not a country on earth that, if they could, wouldn't like to be the United States and control the world, because that's what capitalism is.
But to say that, unless we want to try to get another subject going here, we'll try in a minute. But to say that Russia is not attempting to interfere in other countries' elections, not attempting to interfere so it has more power around the world, is absurd, because they are.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, that's
And
you
so
know,
are the Germans. I mean, I did
Not-
it. No, I'm sorry, you're wrong. I did a documentary in Albania in the late
I know, but
80s,
yeah,
early
no,
90s.
yeah.
I should have brought popcorn.
Yeah. The engineering of the fall of the Albanian government was primarily engineered by the Germans. And then there was a fight between the Americans and the Germans, because the Americans, when the Party of Labor in Albania actually won the first election and was going to continue,
Right.
they actually met with the Undersecretary of State for the Balkans, who said to the leadership, because I happen to know somebody who was actually the secretary for Ramiz Alia, who was the chairman of the party. And he said to Ramiz Alia, "We will support you if you're going to do all these reforms, but on one condition, not the Germans. I don't want the Germans involved. It's only going to be the U.S." And Ramiz Alia said no, and then they helped the Germans then bring them down.
Right.
So this contention goes
Yeah, no,
on.
I understand that, but I guess my response was because you cannot compare the international power of Germany to the international influence of Russia or the international power of the United States.
Not at this point, no.
I mean, they just don't have it.
Not now. But it's an enormous country, and we know
That's
the
enormous,
history of
yes.
Germany, so that can change.
They're not being able to.
But if you look what Germany did to Greece,
Oh, right.
and what it's
and the
doing
European-
within
Sure.
the EU,
Yeah.
so
Right.
In
No,
terms
no,
of
no. I mean,
finance.
the real
We'll
reason
see.
is the EU is.
But here's my main point. We do not need to side with any of the oligarchies when they're fighting amongst themselves. You know, the old lefty terminology, these are inter-imperialist contradictions, and we don't need to side with any of them.
I understand that. But again, I'll come back to my main point. And my main point is that people in the United States care less about that at this moment than they do about getting rid of Trump.
Yeah.
That's the main issue.
And so they should.
Because this right wing turn and the right wing of the wealthiest people in this country have taken power.
And I'll tell you, this obsession with Russia is not helping bring down Trump, because the people that voted for Trump don't give a damn.
No, they don't care at all.
They don't care at all.
No,
so instead of focusing on what's BS about Trump's policies, focusing on Russia's not weakening him an iota unless they bring him down legally.
I spend a lot of time, not a lot of time, I spend some time reading the stuff on Facebook. I have a lot of people because of what I've done in life. So there's this massive amount of people that are on my Facebook page, and a bunch of them are on the right.
Yeah.
And a bunch of them are really hardcore Trump people. When you read the dialogues on their page, it's frightening. I mean, that we have such different views of the same things that take place day after day. And what they say, and the memes they put up, and the racist and misogynist stuff that gets on their page, no matter what Trump does, they find a reason to believe that he's right. I mean, it is really scary. I mean, it's more than anything, that kind of popularization of what Trump has done is the most frightening thing I think we face.
So,
Well, I'll go. The problem, the reason the corporate Dems focus on this Russia stuff instead of his horrible policies, even like the horrible stuff of the undoing of the social safety net, whatever there was of it, even this tariffs and free trade and this, the more they focus on substantive policies, the more you have to ask the question, well, what the hell did you do when you were in power? How did because we know that is the Obama years tilled the soil for the rise of Trump, not deliberately, but the consequence of the widening inequality gap, the consequence of how the 07-08 crisis so benefited the finance sector and other, the billionaires and didn't the others. I mean, all this helped set the table for this. So instead of dealing with the real issues, and I'm not saying all the Democrats, there are some that certainly are focusing on policy, but the main corporate leadership, and certainly the media just loves the fest of it, is they think they can use this old chauvinism, this old warmongering mentality, and tap into that to weaken Trump. And I think, one, they're wrong. They're not really weakening him. And two, it's you play with fire when you dredge up that stuff.
but a lot of people, see that and agree. Like, look how well Rachel Maddow's show is doing, right? Like, I don't.
Amongst people that would never vote for Trump.
Okay.
Like,
that's fair.
it's not influencing the people in the working.
Well, you're not going to. Well, I don't know
the
about
working
that.
class people. You're
Well,
not
first of all, when we say
influencing.
the working class, who are we talking about?
The sections that voted for Trump. I'm saying you're not going to Rachel Maddow. They don't watch Rachel Maddow.
Because I mean, the
They watch Fox.
The working class is made up
there's-
of a lot of brown and black people and progressive
For sure.
white people who are part of the working class.
Yeah,
Even
or
some
Democrats.
of them
Yeah,
voted for
totally.
Even
Lots
some
of
of them voted for Trump.
Yeah, some of them, but
Yeah.
I
No, but
agree
I'm
with
talking
you.
about the sections that did vote for Trump, which is you need to influence. You're going to change some of these electoral
Maybe you do,
results.
maybe you don't. Maybe you can't. Maybe that's not where you should focus. I mean, I think.
Well, that's a different question.
I think that what for me, and I guess part of my reaction sometimes to the conversations we have, is that I'm really less interested in the Russian piece, than I am about how to deal with the right wing who's taking over the country.
No, sure. I think that.
Yeah, but except the media is people are watching, CNNs and MSNBCs and even Fox, and 80% of what they talk about is the Russian piece. So you got to deal with it because it's what the media is harping on. Although I agree, it's not the real issue.
No, I mean, because what we're facing here, I mean, if you just take the area you're covering all the time, climate change, right?
Yeah.
That the Trump administration has dismantled everything that the liberals and people for the left have forced the government to do in monitoring our environment.
Yeah.
Every day something new tumbles out.
And worth noting also, and Russia as well. Russia was one of the states that at COP24 just last week, intentionally blunted the impact of this latest IPCC report that shows we might have just 12 years left to avoid catastrophic consequences of climate change because they're an oil power. And then so did Saudi Arabia and so did Kuwait. It's not a coincidence that.
But I think it's such
Right.
an important point, because that's what people should be attacking Russia for, and viciously. They're putting the whole future of the human race, the civilization as we know it, is at stake, and the bloody Russians are only interested in their fossil fuel.
Sure.
That's what we should attack Russia for.
But the thing to me though is what we should be thinking about is attacking what's happening here in these borders. I mean, the latest piece is they're trying to as you, I don't know if you've covered this yet or not. I think you have. That they're redefining what a wetland is.
Yeah.
So they can build anywhere they want in this
Yeah,
country.
certainly.
And destroy our drinking water for 80% of this country. I mean, and destroy the environment. I mean, it's making it more difficult for solar power to take off.
Totally.
It's just there's a real danger with what these right-wing maniacs are doing.
Totally.
In control of all that. And clearly,
Yeah, and you combine that with the concentration of wealth and these infrastructure plans that just incentivize higher concentrations of wealth and more privatization. And the whole thing ends up being
Right.
an entire mess.
I mean, I think we're in a very, very dangerous place.
I just want to answer one thing you said earlier about you talking to American people and sounding like you hate America, because I think that's a very important question. There is no such thing as just America. Yeah, there's a country, but there's classes in this country. And the American people, one can love, one can be loyal to, one can care about. But that's not the same thing, because the American people don't control U.S. foreign policy. They don't control most of the country.
Yeah.
So when you scathingly critical of U.S. foreign policy is not to be critical of the American people, although it's not without some, because Americans are still voting for people that run these policies, but still. Excuse me. But the issue of we're not all in the same boat, and not all Americans are responsible for the crimes. In fact, they're really not. They're actually suffering from it themselves. I mean, the bottom line is the U.S. empire is not good for the American people. So when you critique these things, you're actually defending the American people by critiquing these things.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. I mean, we live in a very complex place. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, just in terms of its complexity and what we're facing here, is that the questions of race and racism in our country are so deep. I mean, that is at the bottom of what has destroyed, as part of what destroyed the union movement. That's part of what destroyed any kind of class unity that was in taking on power in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in this country, allowing race to tear us apart. And I think
just completed a tour of South America at a point in time in which the continent is
Oh, I'm sorry. That, just in case anyone noticed, that's my phone starting
your
to play
phone.
a real news story, and I have no idea why.
Was it a good story? What's it about?
Began. I don't know.
It's Dimitri's interview with Roger Waters.
Oh, was that the Roger
Yeah.
Waters interview? All right.
Oh, how'd you know that?
Because she watched
Well,
it.
because he said at the beginning that he was about to.
Oh, you
talk to
heard that? I
Roger.
didn't hear that. That's what you get for being a deaf old man. So, good thing I have headphones on, so I can hear you all talk. So,
Well, it seems to me that the question you just asked is the beginning of another podcast.
it is.
So we'll do it again.
We'll do it
next
again.
week.
And this is great. And let us know what you think of these Real News podcasts. I want to know. We all want to know. And here with Paul J. and Dharna Noor,
And
I'm Mark,
this podcast began with a letter from a viewer.
from a viewer.
Well, so this could be part of the thing that will respond to what people
Oh, I love
write
that.
in.
Let's do
Yeah.
that. We can do that.
Send us letters. We'll read
Dharna,
them.
Paul,
And the more critical, the better.
yes. That's Dharna Noor.
Hi.
That's Paul J. And I'm Marc Steiner. Thanks for being part of the Real News podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Bye, y'all.
No, thank you.